Our relationships change the course of our lives, but can they change history? I'm the Affair Archivist, and in this episode, we're uncovering a passionate affair that led to murder and set a legal precedent, the scandalous case of Dan Sickles. On the evening of February 24th, 1859, Congressman Dan Sickles was preparing to attend a party with his young wife, Teresa. Just before leaving, a letter arrived. He slipped it into his pocket and made his way to the festivities. At the party, Sickles found Teresa deep in conversation with Philip Barton Key, the U.S. Attorney for D.C., and the son of Francis Scott Key. When he saw Sickles, Key abruptly ended the exchange and walked away without a word. After he returned home, Sickles remembered the letter. He opened it just before bed. What he read ignited a scandal that rocked the nation and led to a crime of passion that changed not only the lives of those involved, but the course of American legal history. Dan Sickles was born in April of 1819 in New York City, a Knickerbocker whose ancestors immigrated to America in the 17th century. Despite his lineage, it seems Sickles was destined to blaze his own path. He attended private school, but ran away after he was whipped for a minor infraction. Young Sickles worked in the newspaper business for a time and attempted to become a farmer at his father's insistence. However, the quiet pastoral life was not to be for Sickles, and he returned to the newspaper business in Princeton, New Jersey. Sickles' parents, however, begged him to return to New York. He relented and lived with the DePonte family on Spring Street. Lorenzo DePonte was a friend of Sickles' father and the son of an opera singer and clergyman who was cast out of Venice for having an affair. Lorenzo DePonte Sr. adopted a young girl named Maria Cook years earlier. She and her husband, Antonio Baggioli, lived in the same house on Spring Street with their daughter, Teresa. While living in the DePonte's home, Sickles became close with the Baggiolis and often played with Teresa. When DePonte Jr. died, Sickles was grief-stricken, but it led him on a new path in life. He decided to pursue the law. He studied with a private tutor for the bar exam and passed, starting his own practice in 1841. He moved to a home on Broadway in 1843, not far from where the Baggiolis were living. Sickles, a Democrat, decided to pursue a career in politics and was elected to the New York Assembly in 1847. He was instrumental in the creation of Central Park and involved in the Tammany Hall political machine. Sickles got himself embroiled in a few small-scale scandals early on. He raised $1,000 for a political pamphlet that was never published, and most likely pocketed the money to go on vacation to Saratoga Springs. He was charged with grand larceny for selling a piece of land his father owned and withholding the deed from the buyer. He was acquitted on a legal technicality, and no damage was done to his rising political career. Sickles' dirty dealings extended to his personal life. He was a frequent customer at a brothel at 119 Mercer Street and formed a tight bond with the madam of the establishment, Fanny White. Fanny had come from a respected and well-off family. However, she was ruined and disowned after being manipulated into sex with an older man as a young woman. Despite this, she recreated herself as a successful business owner and madam just 4 years after her disgrace, and was wealthier than Sickles, buying him expensive gifts. Sickles flouted his relationship with Fanny, bringing her to the Assembly chamber in Albany, scandalizing his colleagues. In 1853, Sickles departed to London to work for James Buchanan, who was then the ambassador to Great Britain. He brought Fanny with him, and it was said he introduced her to Queen Victoria under an assumed name. The validity of this story, however, has been contested. On September 27, 1852, Sickles married the young girl he played with just shy of a decade before, Teresa Baggioli, in a private civil ceremony. Teresa was still attending Catholic school when she was married. Neither of their families were in attendance, and both were upset when they heard the news. Sickles was 33 years old, while Teresa was just 16. It was believed to be a shotgun wedding, that Teresa was in the early stages of pregnancy. This is not known for sure, as their daughter Laura's birth date is unknown. In a letter written in February of 1859, Teresa mentions her daughter as 6 years old. Therefore, it is believed she gave birth in early 1853, which indicates that Teresa was pregnant at the time of her marriage. 6 months later, Teresa and Sickles were married in a Catholic ceremony, likely at the insistence of her parents. They lived with the Bagiolis on Prince Street. Sickles departed for his post in England shortly after the marriage. Teresa begged him to stay, but he refused. She could not go with him, since their daughter was too young to make the crossing. After his return to the United States, Sickles' star continued to rise in the political arena. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1856. This coincided with the election of Democrat James Buchanan to the presidency, who Sickles had ingratiated himself with while working for him in England. Sickles and Teresa attended Buchanan's inaugural ball on March 5, 1857. There, they met Philip Barton Key. As mentioned earlier, Key was the son of Francis Scott Key, the writer of the Star-Spangled Banner, born in 1818 in Georgetown. He was good-looking, tall, politically connected, and currently serving as D.C.'s district attorney. He was a widower and father of 4 children. He married his wife, Ellen Swan, in 1845, after being challenged to a duel by a man who believed he had stolen her from him. Her death left him devastated, and he believed his health was failing as a result. By all accounts, however, he was fine, and whatever ailments he may have thought he had, it did not stop him from becoming a playboy. At the time of the inauguration, Key felt uneasy about his standing in Washington. His tenure as district attorney was not going well. He had just lost a prominent case and feared he would lose his position. He appealed to Sickles to vouch for him to Buchanan. Sickles agreed, and Key was reappointed. After this, Key continued asking Sickles for favors on behalf of friends and family. The two were forming a bond, and Sickles never hesitated to pull strings on behalf of Key. Perhaps he would have rethought this had he known how close Key would become to his wife. In the fall of 1857, the Sickles moved to Washington before Dan's first session in Congress began. As the wife of a congressman, Teresa was obligated to establish a social presence in the capital, both by hosting parties in her home and by attending various events around the capital. She fulfilled this duty with enthusiasm, doing the grocery shopping and preparations for the household's weekly parties. The president was a frequent guest at their home in the fashionable Lafayette Square, just a stone's throw away from the White House. Teresa was well received in Washington and was invited to all of society's most fashionable gatherings. However, Sickles was often too busy to accompany her. The Civil War was fast approaching, and the controversy over whether or not Kansas would enter the Union as a free or slave state occupied much of his time. Instead, Teresa went to parties, the theater, and other festivities with a few different bachelors, which was fine with her husband. At these events, Teresa often ran into Philip Barton Key, who was a fixture in the Washington social scene. The perfect storm was brewing. Key was charming and handsome. Teresa was beautiful, young, and naive, and her marriage was on the rocks. Sickles often criticized her for her innocence and naivete. However, she may not have been as ignorant as Sickles believed her to be. She knew he was often unfaithful. Thank heavens there is very little, if any, jealousy in my composition, and I do not think I could be jealous of a person I had never seen or known. This knowledge may have prompted Teresa to begin an affair with Key. Not long after arriving in Washington and establishing a reputation within the social scene, Teresa was arranging private meetings with Key. It did not take long for rumors about their sudden closeness to circulate around Washington. Sickles received the first letter warning him of his wife's unfaithfulness from George B. Woolridge, a clerk in the map department of the House of Representatives. Woolridge claimed that Key and Teresa rode horseback together 3 times while Sickles was on business in New York. During one of these horseback riding excursions, the pair got a room together in a lodge, only staying for an hour and a half. Woolridge said there was no doubt there was an intimacy between Mr. Key and Mrs. Sickles. Woolridge claimed that these stories had been relayed to him by Samuel B. Beekman, one of the men who often accompanied Teresa to parties, who was said to have feelings for her. Sickles confronted Beekman about the rumors he was supposedly spreading about his wife. Beekman denied it. Key was outraged by the allegations. "It is the highest affront which can be offered to me, and whoever asserts it must meet me on the field of honor, at the very point of the pistol." Key also asked Beekman to answer for his supposed loose lips. This resulted in the man resigning his post with the House of Representatives, a job Sickles got him, and leaving Washington for good. For the time being, Key was in the clear. Sickles believed he and Teresa were innocent and told him he hoped their relations would continue as previously, believing him to be a man of honor. This may have seemed like a vote of confidence on the surface. However, Sickles prohibited Key's presence in his home when he was not there. He also asked a friend and fellow Congressman, John Haskin, to keep tabs on his wife while he was working in New York. When Haskin came to call, he let himself in the front door without knocking, made his way through the house and into the library, where he found Teresa and Key alone, eating salad and drinking champagne. Teresa invited him and his wife to join, but they declined. As they left, Haskin's wife called Teresa a bad woman. They did not check on her again, and, oddly, Haskin said not a word of this odd encounter to Sickles. In April of 1858, Sickles was too sick to attend a costume ball as rumors continued to abound about his wife's relationship with Key. Teresa's mother insisted she attend without him to keep up appearances. She went dressed as Little Red Riding Hood, while Key was an English hunter. They left the party together at 2 o'clock in the morning and went to the National Hotel. They talked outside of the hotel in their carriage for some time. Then Key departed. Despite their previous recklessness, perhaps Key thought better of being seen with Teresa in a hotel so conspicuously. However, that didn't stop him from making frequent visits to the Sickles home. Teresa later admitted that she and Key made love for the first time on a red couch outside of the study not long after the costume ball. Key and Teresa continued seeing each other publicly and privately, taking little care to conceal their relationship. Upon Key's frequent visits to Teresa's home, the servants said, "Here comes disgrace to see disgust." They often heard the sound of Key and Teresa being physical in the back parlor. At the parties they attended together, Key addressed Teresa as Madame to create the illusion of formality around their relationship. However, no one fell for this feeble ruse. They sometimes went to parties together in the Sickles carriage and enjoyed horseback riding in the Congressional Cemetery, which in hindsight foreshadowed the end result of their risky love affair. Key was often seen across the street from the Sickles home, signaling to Teresa with a white handkerchief. He seems to clasp his handkerchief, let it fall, clasp it again, and catch it before it could fall any distance. In the autumn of 1858, aware that the frequent visits to the Sickles home were arousing suspicions, Key rented a home in a working-class, mixed-race neighborhood at 383 15th Street. The home was owned by a black man named John Gray. Key paid $50 a month just to use the home for their supposedly clandestine affair. The home had an exit through an alleyway, which he believed would maintain their secrecy and anonymity. This did not fool anyone, however. Often a white ribbon or string was tied to the shutter of the second-floor window, signaling Teresa to enter the home. Teresa neglected to wear a veil when entering the house on numerous occasions. Key's friends warned him that he was over-attentive to Teresa. He claimed that he was taking merely a paternalistic interest in the young woman, saying he had only kind and fatherly feelings towards her. It seems Key enjoyed the excitement that came along with having an affair, saying, "A fight for common license, French intrigue and romance, with a good spice of danger in it." Not only was he addicted to the danger, he was confident he would be just fine if exposed. "I am prepared for any emergency," he said as he tapped on the pocket of his coat, presumably where his gun was stored. Sickles is a damned Yankee and would do nothing if he found out. Meanwhile, Sickles was busy having sexual relations outside of his marriage as well. While on business in Baltimore in January of 1859, he checked into a hotel and went to his room upstairs. Soon after, Mrs. Sickles joined him in his room. This Mrs. Sickles was not the Mrs. Sickles, of course, and this was not the last time an impostor would accompany Dan to his hotel room. Teresa and Key's reckless abandon caught up with them by February. On the 23rd, a Wednesday, Key brought Laura Sickles to a neighbor's house and asked if they could watch her. He then left to meet Teresa at number 383 on 15th Street. As they were having sex inside the home, an unidentified man asked a woman who lived in the neighborhood if the home was occupied. She replied yes. "Very well, that's all I want." The unidentified man lingered around the neighborhood until Key emerged from the home and spoke to him briefly, then left. Earlier that day, Key received a letter written in code, likely written by the same man. However, busy arranging his meeting with Teresa, he did not have time to decode or read it. It could be that the man was attempting to blackmail him and was asking if he had read the letter. However, this is impossible to know. He attended the theater with Teresa that evening, an outing Sickles was aware of. He was too busy with work to attend. The following day, Teresa was preparing for a party she was hosting and went shopping with Key in tow. He began reading and discussing the letter he received the previous day with her. A witness followed them as they walked, but he could not hear them or make out what the letter said. To this day, no one knows what the letter said or who wrote it. As they departed, Key noted something was off with Teresa's eyes, that she was looking unwell. She asked her coachman to drive her home quickly. That night, Sickles received an anonymous letter of his own. He was distracted by a party he was set to attend, and did not get around to opening the correspondence until much later that evening when he returned home. It read, "Dear Sir, with deep regret I enclose to you your address. The few lines, but an indispensable duty compels me so to do, seeing that you are greatly imposed upon. There is a fellow, I may say, for he is not a gentleman by any means, by the name of Philip Barton Key, and I believe the district attorney, who rents a house of a man by the name of John Gray, situated on 15th Street between K and L Streets, for no other purpose than to meet your wife, Mrs. Sickles. He hangs a string out of the window as a signal to her that he is in, and leaves the door unfastened, and she walks in. And, sir, do I assure you, he has much the use of your wife as you have. With these few hints I leave the rest for you to imagine. Most respectfully, your friend, R.P.G." Sickles had no idea who R.P.G. was, but that was the least of his problems. The following day, he began an investigation into the claims of the anonymous letter. He went to 15th Street, and several witnesses identified Key, who was well known given his father's fame. However, they did not know who the woman he was with was, but positively identified several articles of Teresa's clothing. Nonetheless, Sickles didn't consider this solid proof and continued his inquiry. He placed an ad in the paper to get to the bottom of who RPG was, which was to run that Sunday. He kept it vague enough so that no one would suspect his intentions for identifying the anonymous source. RPG, who recently addressed a letter to a gentleman in the city, will confer a great favor upon the gentleman to whom the letter was addressed by granting him an early, immediate, confidential interview. Sickles met up with Woolridge, the first to warn him of Teresa's rumored indiscretions. He attempted to read the letter to him, but broke down in tears. Woolridge assisted in the investigation by interviewing witnesses in the neighborhood. A young biracial man, Crittenden Bayless, provided key information. He lived across the street from 383 with his mother, and said he saw Key and Teresa meet on Thursday. Woolridge brought Bayless to speak with Sickles. When he told Sickles he had seen Key on Thursday, Sickles knew the letter was wrong. Teresa could not be with Key on that day, as she was preparing for the party she was hosting and visiting her friends' homes. He was relieved, but a storm was brewing above Washington that weekend. Woolridge stayed at the Bayless home across the street, waiting for Key and or Teresa to appear. He and the young man continued to discuss the strange meetings between Key and Teresa. Then Bayless remembered. It was Wednesday, not Thursday. Woolridge and Bayless returned to Sickles, who was informed of the correction. Sickles finally accepted that his wife was cheating on him. He was beside himself. Mr. Sickles had a very wild, distracted look. He returned to his home, but did not eat dinner with his family. Teresa heard him crying in his room and went to him. Their maid, Bridget, said she heard loud talking. As time went on, the loud talking transitioned into a full-blown argument. When Bridget knocked on the door to bring Sickles his dinner tray, they fell silent. He had broken Teresa's wedding ring. He asked Bridget and Octavia M. Ridgely, Teresa's friend who was staying at their home, to come into the bedroom. Teresa was writing a confession letter, and he wanted witnesses present. "I have been in a house in 15th Street with Mr. Key. How many times I don't know. I did what is usual for a wicked woman to do. The intimacy commenced this winter, when I came from New York, in that house. An intimacy of an improper kind. Have met half a dozen times or more at different hours of the day, on Monday of this week and Wednesday also. We arranged meetings when we met in the street and at parties. Teresa slept on the floor of Octavia's room. Sickles cried unearthly groans for the entirety of the night. The following day, his grief morphed into outrage. On the morning of Sunday, February 27th, Philip Barton Key went to the barber shop for a shave. He then made his way to Lafayette Square. Though he was ignorant of the domestic drama unfolding inside, he made an offhand comment about Sickles killing him. This premonition did not stop him from taking out his white handkerchief and signaling to Teresa. This time, there was no response. Inside the home in Lafayette Square, Sickles summoned his friend Samuel F. Butterworth, a fellow New York politician. Butterworth found Sickles in his bedroom, lying on his face on his pillow, overwhelmed with grief. He relayed the events of the previous day to him. Butterworth advised Sickles to send Teresa and her mother back to New York. The current session of Congress was near its end, and their departure from the capital would not raise any eyebrows. Once Congress was in recess, Sickles should go to Europe while a separation agreement was drawn up. "This is a terrible affair," he said. After reading Teresa's confession, Butterworth went to a nearby tavern for a glass of ale. Meanwhile, Key continued in vain to signal to Teresa. Again, he seemed to have a foreboding feeling that he unfortunately did not heed, telling an acquaintance he ran into, "I am despondent about my health and very desperate. Indeed, I have half a mind to go on the prairies and try buffalo hunting. The excursion would either cure me or kill me, and really, I don't care much which." At one point, Sickles' dog, Dandy, ran across the street and jumped on Key, begging for attention and pets, showing just how often Key was invited over to the Sickles home. He used his handkerchief to play with the dog. Sickles saw him from the window. "The villain has just passed my house. The scoundrel is making signals. This is horrible." Butterworth, after returning from the tavern, tried to tell Sickles to simmer down, reassuring him that only they knew about the affair. "The whole world, the whole town knew it," Sickles replied. Though the whole world did not know yet, he was certainly correct about the whole city being privy to the affair. "It is already the town talk." Butterworth fatefully told Sickles, "If that be so, there is but one course left you as a man of honor. You need no advice." He briefly considered challenging Key to a duel, but then Sickles decided to find Key and dole out justice in a different manner. Sickles and Butterworth planned to go to the neighborhood tavern and inquired if Key was renting a room there, and for what purpose he uses it. Before leaving the house, Sickles went to retrieve his weapons, 2 Derringer shotguns and a revolver. Butterworth claimed that he thought Sickles was trailing behind him. He ran into Key as he made his way to the tavern and struck up a conversation with him, asking if another friend was staying at the clubhouse. Key replied that the man was. Butterworth claims that at that point, he told Key he was going to visit the man and made his way to the tavern. As he turned to leave, he saw Sickles approaching. He would later be accused of intentionally distracting Key with a conversation to give Sickles enough time to grab his weapons and corner the district attorney. Butterworth denied this. On that Sunday afternoon, just a short walk away from the White House, Dan Sickles was armed and ready to pounce. "Key, you scoundrel, you have dishonored my house, and you must die." Key reached into his coat pocket and walked toward Sickles, just as he was firing the first shot, which grazed Key. "Murder!" he cried. Sickles prepared to fire again. Key lunged at him and grabbed the collar of his coat. He attempted to use the object he had taken out of his pocket, opera glasses, to strike Sickles. The 2 men struggled, causing Sickles to end up in the street, dropping his weapon. Sickles tried to pull away from Key, but Key wrapped his arms around his waist. They made their way into the park as the fight intensified. Sickles managed to pry himself out of Key's grip. He grabbed another gun from his pocket and aimed it at Key. "Don't murder me!" Key cried. He backed away as Sickles pursued him, throwing the opera glasses at his attacker. The object hit him, but Sickles was undeterred. He fired again, this time striking Key near the groin. "I'm shot!" Key yelled. He ambled towards the sidewalk, begging Sickles to hold his fire. "You villain! You have dishonored my house, and you must die!" Key clung to a tree, then collapsed on his side, clasping his wound. He tried to get himself up, most likely to attempt to escape, but it was in vain. Sickles fired again. This time the gun misfired. "Murder! Murder!" Key screamed. Sickles readied the weapon against Key's chest and fired again at point-blank range. This was the mortal wound. It entered Key's body between his ribs, pierced his spleen, and was lodged into his hip bone. Key's chest filled with blood, and he collapsed. Sickles, not content, pressed the barrel of the gun against Key's head, going in for the kill. But the weapon once again misfired. A man named Thomas Martin intervened and drew Sickles away from the dying Key. "Is the scoundrel dead?" Martin took Key into his arms and gave Sickles a pleading, quizzical look. "He has defiled my bed," he calmly said. One witness noted how pale he was. Butterworth, who watched the entire thing, ushered Sickles away from the crime scene. Sickles put the gun back in his pocket. Key was brought into the tavern and sat upright on the floor by an overturned chair. A doctor was sent for, but the situation was hopeless. Martin asked if he had any last words, but in his dying delirium, it seemed that Key could not speak or understand the question. The doctor came before Key drew his final breath and determined his wounds were fatal. He died shortly after. Numerous onlookers watched Key take his final breath and robbed him of some of his belongings after he passed. Butterworth brought Sickles to the home of Jeremiah Black, the Attorney General. He was told that Key had died. "One wretch less in the world," Sickles said. However, his emotions swung violently between a cold-blooded tranquility and hysterical grief. A friend said Sickles put his hands on his face and made an agony of unnatural and unearthly sounds, the most remarkable, something like a scream, interrupted by violent sobbing. He periodically went into fits of convulsions as well. He was arrested not long after and allowed to visit his home before being hauled to jail. He went upstairs to see Teresa. He spoke just one sentence to his estranged wife: "I've killed him." Sickles was imprisoned in the Blue Jug, as it would later be known during the Civil War, for its coating of blue paint. The prison was built in 1839 and had a horrific reputation. It was overcrowded, full of vermin, had very little ventilation, no sewage system, and nowhere for prisoners to bathe. Multiple prisoners were crammed into one cell. Sickles was appalled by the conditions. "Haven't you a better room to put me in?" The jailer responded, "No. This is the best place you members of Congress have afforded us." Sickles sobbed throughout his first night in prison. A minister was brought to act as a messenger between Sickles and Teresa. She begged him to give her wedding ring back. He agreed, but insisted on a formal separation. The affair and ensuing murder incited a media sensation rarely seen in the pre-Civil War United States. Sickles was previously concerned about all of Washington knowing that he was cuckolded, but after murdering Key, the whole world knew. "Our presses have been going night and day without cessation," one journalist wrote. Rumors surrounding the affair and murder abounded. Some papers alleged that Teresa was pregnant with Key's child, that Sickles attempted suicide following the murder, that Key's younger brother swore revenge, and that President Buchanan visited Sickles in prison. None of these assertions were accurate, but they made for a titillating story that captured the nation's attention. The scandal made headlines not just in America, but in Europe as well. The media was split as to whether Sickles was in the right. A Philadelphia newspaper called the North American wrote, "Alas, for the morals of a nation when murder haunts the thoughts of its representatives, and crime even baser finds shelter under the robes of the law." Reverend Henry Ward Beecher decried the murder as a sore of depravity and was critical of the media field day that it sparked. Many blamed Sickles for his wife's behavior, with the New York Post asserting, "The character of the husband too often corrupts that of the wife." Sickles had many political and personal enemies that hoped the murder would bring about his downfall. The Albany Evening Statesman wrote that he has a reputation for everything but integrity, honor, morality, and manhood. Several others blamed Sickles for allowing his wife to cavort around town with other men, believing he had brought the betrayal onto himself. His political career seemed to be as dead as Key. Though many were critical of Sickles, overall, public opinion sided with him and lambasted Teresa and Key. In the Victorian era, marriage was seen as sacred, one of the pillars that held up society, along with religion. Teresa's transgressions destroyed her social position and saddled her with a reputation as a fallen woman, a stain that a woman in this time period could not escape. The New York Herald wrote, "The general impression among the female sex seemed to be that there was no excuse for Mrs. Sickles, that she had position, attention, and a confiding husband, all that a woman could wish for, and that she deserved the most stringent fate for her violation of the dictates of virtue. In this censure, they hardly thought of the punishment the unfortunate woman will suffer for the remainder of her life." Some compassion was shown towards Teresa, however, with the press noting how young and innocent she was when she was married, which made her an ideal candidate for manipulation at the hands of an older and charming man like Key. Speaking of Key, few had sympathy for him. The Evening Star wrote, "We have nothing whatever to say in extenuation of the conduct of Mr. Key, as when a man invades the marital rights of another, he carries his life in his hand." Key's funeral was held on March 1st. His 4 young children stayed with their grandmother in Baltimore, and they were raised by his sister Alice after being orphaned. As Key was laid to rest, Sickles received an upgrade in his accommodations in jail. He was permitted to stay in the jailer's office, which had no rats and was much better ventilated. He received home-cooked meals and was allowed unlimited visits from his friends, who included the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Treasury. He would have a breakdown at the mention of his wife and/or his daughter, and when Laura visited, he was clearly disturbed and upset. He worried about the effects the scandal would have on her life. Teresa wrote to him, and, unbeknownst to the public, Sickles wrote back. Had the public been aware that Sickles was speaking to her, they may not have been so sympathetic to his ordeal. Sickles forgave Teresa for her indiscretions. She wrote to him with gratitude. "Thank you many times for all your kind expressions, and God bless you for the mercy and prayers you offer up to me." Teresa, however, eventually called Sickles out for his hypocrisy in another correspondence. "You say that any object you have loved remains dear to you. Do I now stand upon a footing with other women I know you have loved? I have long felt like asking you what your love affairs have been, love of the heart, or love of their superior qualities such as you have often informed me I did not possess, or attraction of face and form, or an infatuation. If during the first years we were married my good conduct did not keep you true to me, can I suppose for the moment the last year has? Ask your own heart who sinned first, and then tell me, if you will." On the eve of the trial, Sickles was interviewed by a journalist for Boston's Atlas and Daily Bee from his jail cell. He described Sickles as one of the coolest men living. The deliberate manner in which he approached Key, not knowing whether the latter was armed or not, and notified him that he must prepare to die, giving Key, whom Sickles had a right to suppose was armed, a chance to draw upon him, is an evidence of this. Not less cool was the manner in which he described to the writer, in his cell in Washington, the manner in which he perpetrated the bloody deed. Sickles, puffing a cigar throughout the interview, recounted events with painstaking detail. "He dishonored me, and we could not both live on the same planet." Sickles' trial began on April 5, 1859, a cold and dreary day. The courtroom was packed, becoming hot and stuffy despite the unseasonably cold weather outside. It was covered extensively by the press, and even soon-to-be President Abraham Lincoln was enraptured with all the tawdry details. Sickles was represented by 8 lawyers. Interestingly, Samuel Butterworth was not called to testify as a witness, and the prosecutor said that he did not summon him for a reason Butterworth was aware of. What that reason was, nobody knows. However, it is believed that Butterworth would have incriminated himself had he testified. Key's family insisted that the prosecution zero in on Sickles' bad behavior and character flaws, and denied that Key had an affair with Teresa. Buchanan appointed Key's former assistant, Robert Ould, as the new district attorney. Many believed that he went easy on Sickles throughout the trial. Still, Ould insisted that Sickles acted with remorseless revenge and deserved to be punished. The prosecution was intent on ensuring that the trial remained focused on Sickles' actions and the murder, and not Key's behavior. Sickles' extensive legal team contended that Sickles had the right to avenge his marriage under the Bible, and that his honor had been violated. They also argued that his state of mind at the time of the murder was unstable, and that he had gone temporarily insane. While insanity itself had been used as a defense in the United States before, never had a defendant's legal team asserted temporary insanity as a justification for murder. This idea was pushed by one of Sickles' attorneys, John Graham. He stated that the burden of proof was on the prosecution to show that Sickles was sane at the time of the murder. This was another groundbreaking legal tactic. Additionally, had Sickles seen Teresa and Key making love with his own eyes, he would have been given the lesser charge of manslaughter. Graham insisted that even the knowledge of the affair was akin to seeing his wife sleeping with Key, and caused Sickles to lose his grip on reality. The prosecution tried in vain to keep the details of Key and Teresa's affair out of the murder trial. However, the judge ruled against them, believing this evidence was admissible. The defense called 43 witnesses to the stand that testified regarding the details of the illicit romance. During this painstaking testimony, Sickles was emotionally shattered and was removed from the courtroom 3 times. His worst breakdown occurred after one of the witnesses described his emotional state after the murder. His countenance still indicated extreme mental suffering, and the desolateness of his whole appearance awakening strong sympathy in the breasts of all who saw him. There was an effort on the defense's behalf to get Teresa's confession letter submitted as evidence and read in court. However, the judge would not allow it, asserting that such intimate details should stay between husband and wife. Interestingly, the confession letter was leaked to the papers the following day, which enthralled and enraged the nation. The defense denied having anything to do with the leak. The prosecution attempted to mount a counterattack on Sickles' character and extramarital activities, noting the various Mrs. Sickles he brought to hotels. However, the judge again refused to allow the jury to hear this information, stating that Sickles' behavior outside of the murder was not relevant to the trial. In addition to temporary insanity, Sickles' defense argued in their closing statements that what Dan had done was honorable because he was trying to save his wife and daughter from disgrace. The death of Key was a cheap sacrifice to save one mother from the horrible fate which on that Sabbath day hung over this prisoner's wife and the mother of his child. The prosecution tried to remind the jury that this was a murder trial, not an adultery trial. The judge told the jury that the question was whether Sickles was sane during the murder. If they had any doubts about his state of mind at this time, they should acquit him. This established a legal precedent that is still used throughout the United States today. The trial concluded on April 26th. Sickles was prepared for the worst as the jury deliberated. Many believed that the jury would make their decision to acquit Sickles without leaving the box. However, when they went to deliberate, the possibility of a hung jury seemed imminent. In reality, the deliberation did not take long at all. 11 jurors quickly agreed on the verdict, while the one holdout prayed for guidance and held up the proceedings. Sickles calmly awaited his fate. He was found not guilty of the murder of Philip Barton Key. Cheering broke out in the courtroom. Sickles thanked the jury for his safe deliverance. Olds said he thought it would be so. Sickles left the courtroom to crowds of people congratulating him on his freedom. The media was also on his side and blamed the prosecution for the outcome, believing that Olds' connection with the president resulted in an easy trial for Sickles. A juror said the jury gave their verdict on the principle that, in the absence of any adequate punishment by law for adultery, the man who violates the honor and desolates the home of his neighbor does so at the peril of his life, and if he falls by the outraged husband's hands, he deserves his doom. Before returning to New York, Sickles returned to the crime scene and recounted the events of the Sunday afternoon in February, where he avenged his marriage and honor, or perhaps his profoundly wounded ego. He described the life and death struggle that he and Key engaged in, showing very little remorse or regret for what had happened. That summer, it seemed as though the unprecedented media circus that the murder unleashed was about to die down, when suddenly it picked up again, with almost as intense fervor as it had when it began. After leaving Washington, Sickles was back in New York City, living with his father. Teresa was living in the home they bought before Sickles was elected to Congress with their daughter. The New York Herald reported that Sickles and Teresa were seeing each other again, and were going to resume marital relations if they had not already done so. It was reported that they agreed to let bygones be bygones for the sake of their family. As soon as the story ran, the public swiftly turned on Sickles and felt that they had been betrayed and misled. The New York Times wrote, "There will be fresh sympathies aroused for the dead man who moulders in his grave unforgiven while the partner of his guilt smiles her gratitude up into the face of him whose mercy was so tardy while his justice was so swift. Indeed, for the first time since his untimely death, people felt sympathy for Key. Even Sickles' friends, who had stood by him during the trial, were angry that he had reconciled with Teresa. They truly believed he was having a break with reality, but now that he had forgiven her, they felt perhaps he had manipulated them. Overall, it was believed that if Sickles could forgive Teresa, he could have also forgiven Key and spared his life. Sickles fought back in a lengthy letter to the editor of the New York Herald. This was reprinted in newspapers across America. He asserted his right to privacy and his intention to protect his daughter. In order to ensure Laura had a chance at life, he had to save Teresa from public shame and infamy. He pleaded for people to treat his wife with compassion for the sake of his daughter, and that there was no law against forgiveness in such a situation. He believed he was saving Teresa from a grim future, an utterly desolate position of an offending though penitent woman, the hopeless future with its dark possibilities of danger to which she is doomed when proscribed as an outcast. He said he did not care about the impact this would have on his political career. He did not mention Key or the murder in the letter. This did little to rehabilitate his ruined reputation. Sickles and Teresa symbolized, according to the New York Herald, a bad state of society, wherein political success and power are to be had at any sacrifice of personal honor and private morality. He returned to Washington for the next session of Congress in December of 1859. However, his political career was all but over. Buchanan cut ties with him, and he was sidelined by his fellow congressmen. Interestingly, many demanded he resign from his position, a proposition that only seemed to come about after he forgave Teresa, not after he murdered Key. He did not seek re-election when the time came, and it seemed that he was destined to fade into obscurity, as was the memory of the scandal. However, shortly after, the American Civil War broke out, and Sickles formed his own volunteer unit, the Excelsior Brigade, rising to the rank of Major General. He was hell-bent on starting the unit and fighting to preserve the Union, but left the hefty bills he racked up to organize the brigade on somebody else's lap. It was suggested that Teresa visit wounded soldiers in the hospital in an attempt to relaunch his political career. Teresa was open to the idea, but wrote to Sickles to ask permission. It is unknown what he wrote back, but she never took this opportunity, suggesting that Sickles did not allow it. Sickles fought with distinction at several battles, the most notable of which was the Battle of Gettysburg. Defying orders, he broke the Union line to advance to a nearby peach orchard, weakening their defenses. Confederate General James Longstreet took advantage of the breach and attacked, resulting in major casualties for Sickles' unit. Sickles himself was wounded, losing his leg to an artillery shell. The battle was won, however, signifying the turning point of the war, and Sickles was looked at as a hero and awarded the Medal of Honor. He became friends with President Lincoln and the First Lady. He received a hero's welcome upon his return to New York City. He and Teresa lived apart. His service in the Civil War, not the scandal or his time in Congress, would define his legacy. Tragically, Teresa died of tuberculosis on February 5, 1867, at age 31. The eulogy, delivered by the pastor of the church, focused more on Sickles' accomplishments than Teresa's life and legacy. Her final resting place is unknown, but she and Sickles were not interred together. In 1869, Sickles was appointed American minister to Spain by Ulysses S. Grant. He brought Laura with him. She was now 16 and going through a rebellious phase. She had an affair with a Spanish officer and was angry when her father remarried a wealthy Spanish woman named Carolina Cree. Sickles had 2 children with his second wife, but became estranged from them when he moved back to New York several years later, and did not see or speak to his children for years. He and Laura also had a falling out. She went to live with her grandmother when they returned to New York, married a butcher, and lived in Brooklyn. When she died at age 38, her father did not attend her funeral. Sickles was appointed chairman of the New York State Monuments Commission in 1886 and was re-elected to Congress in 1893. However, he was fired from the former position when he was accused of misappropriating $28,000 of funds in 1912. He died 2 years later of a cerebral hemorrhage, having just reunited with his wife, Carolina, a few months prior. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Sickles' trial established the unwritten law, which was enforced in many similar cases. The unwritten law provided a defense for those who committed crimes of passion. It was believed that men had a right to defend their honor when they were cuckolded, or when a female family member was taken advantage of. Since women were believed to be the weaker sex and easily manipulated, it was believed that their seducers should pay the ultimate price for their transgressions. This unspoken code allowed numerous killers to go free. The unwritten law was no longer in use by the late 1950s, as women's roles in society were changing. However, the temporary insanity plea is still used in courts today. Dan Sickles nearly faced a similar fate of his fallen wife for an unlikely sin, forgiveness. However, his status as a politically connected man and his service in the Civil War spared him the notoriety he deserved and resulted in him being considered a hero for decades. Meanwhile, Teresa and Key both died untimely deaths and received very little sympathy from the public for what happened to them. They did play with fire for having their affair, but Sickles was also guilty of infidelity. While his decision to forgive Teresa for the sake of their family restores some of his honor, Sickles acted with impulsive rage, took another man's life, and sparked a scandal that was then considered the trial of the century. In the end, it seems his political clout, not his temporary insanity, allowed him to get away with murder. Thank you very much for watching. I'm the Affair Archivist. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and join me next time as we explore another affair from history.